All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our final Hidden Histories. My name is Tracy Kwan, and I'm a board member for the Portland Chinatown Museum. We welcome you back. Many familiar faces or names on our attendees list. We welcome you back to Hidden Histories and offer a land acknowledgement before we get started. The Portland Chinatown Museum acknowledges and honors the Indigenous peoples and their descendants of the Lower Columbia and Willamette River region, whose lands the City of Portland and our museum currently occupy. These include Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Watlala Chinook tribes, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and the many other Chinookan peoples who established communities along the Lower Columbia, whose descendants today are members of the Grand Ronde, Warm Springs, and Siletz Confederated Tribes of Oregon. I'll hand this off to Anna Truxas, who will tell you more about the Hidden History series.
Thank you, Tracy. As the Hidden History series comes to a close today, we want to take a moment and acknowledge and thank our Hidden Histories presenters and community partners whose generous contributions of time and knowledge made this much needed program so compelling and memorable. Our deepest gratitude and appreciation go to Chelsea Rose and the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project, to Barry Fong and Laura Ng with the Kangdong Village Project at Stanford University, to Kimberly Fitzgerald from the City of Salem, Kylie Pine and the Willamette Heritage Center, Dr. Myron Lee and Zhuwen Zhang from Willamette University, to Dr. Jacqueline Peterson Loomis, Bertha Saget, and Norman Locke with the Portland Chinatown Museum, to writer Jessica Shee, to Dawn Han, Katie Withy, and Jocelyn Lee working with the Malheur National Forest, to Don Merritt and the Kamwa Chung, State Heritage Site, and to Choi Mei Ho and Bennett Bronson, to Jacqueline Chung and Eric Gleason in the Dalles Chinatown, to Dr. Chelsea K. Vaughn and Lisa Penner at the Clatsop County Historical Society, and to Suen Ho of Resolve Architecture and Planning. And finally, to Priscilla Weggers and Renee Campbell from the University of Idaho's Asian American Comparative Collection. Those are all of our honored presenters, and we thank you very much for your partnership. We also want to recognize our museum staff for their work in bringing this important series to all of you today, including Dr. Jacqueline Peterson Loomis, Linda Rondinelli, Kapiolani Lee, Sarah Chung, and Tracy Kwan. We also want to thank you, our audience, for supporting Hidden Histories and learning along with us about Oregon's rich Chinese American history. And we hope that you will continue to revisit these presentations on our website and Vimeo page and share them with your own communities and networks. Next, we have Museum Board Member Sarah Chung, who's going to share a little bit about today's presentation. And thank you again.
Hi, good morning. Hidden Histories was made possible in part by a grant from the Oregon Humanities, which is a statewide nonprofit organization and an independent affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which funds Oregon Humanities and grant program. Today we are joined by Priscilla Weggers and Renee Campbell, who will be presenting Pendleton's Early Chinese Community, Underground Tunnel Myth versus Above Ground History. Since at least the 1980s, tourism, media depictions, and even well-known works of fiction have promoted the idea that 19th century Chinese immigrants built and occupied an extensive tunnel network under the city of Pendleton, Oregon, and in many other locations throughout the American West. In this program, Priscilla Weggers and Renee Campbell will explore these Chinese tunnel rumors and compare those in Pendleton with the historical record of Pendleton's Chinese community. With time permitting, a short question and answer will conclude the program. I would suggest that if you do have a comment about the program, you enter that in the chat function of Zoom. And if you have a question direct to our presenters today, that use the Q&A button. So to begin the program, our museum staff member, Kapiolani Lee, will introduce our guests. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. I'm going to share the bios for our presenters today. I'm going to begin with Priscilla. Priscilla Weggers, PhD, founded the University of Idaho's Asian American Comparative Collection, a unique resource of artifacts, images, and documentary materials essential for understanding Asian American archaeological sites, economic contributions, and cultural history. She edited Hidden Heritage, Historical Archaeology of the Overseas Chinese in 1993, co-edited Chinese American Death Rituals, Respecting the Ancestors in 2005 with Su-Fan Chung, and wrote Polybemus, The Life and Times of a Chinese American Pioneer in 2020. Renee Campbell is a research associate at the University of Idaho's Asian American Comparative Collection. And she is also currently a historical archaeology doctoral student at the University of Idaho. She comes from a cultural resource management background and has conducted historical and archaeological research in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. She collaborated with several partners to create the Historical Japanese Ceramic Comparative Collection, which is based on her master's research and is one of the first online resources for identifying and describing archaeological Japanese ceramics. So welcome. I'm going to hand it over to our presenters today.
All right. Well, thank you guys. I'm going to bring up our slides. Oh, wait, let's see. How come I can't get to that? Okay, does that look right to everyone?
Right.
Looks good.
Okay.
Okay, and
So
you can hear us.
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, after that long introduction, thank you to the Portland Chinatown Museum for hosting this series and for asking us to participate, and especially to Kapiolani Lee for her technical assistance and coordination for this presentation. We feel really honored to be closing out this series, which has featured so many great presentations by others. And we hope that if they have not already, viewers will go back and watch the rest of the recordings from the Hidden Histories series on the Portland Chinatown Museum's website. As we begin, we want to first acknowledge that the history we will be discussing today, that of Pendleton's early Chinese community and of tunnel myths in the American West more broadly, all take place on Indigenous land. Pendleton, Oregon in particular, is located within the traditional territories of the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla people, whose ties to the area continue today, despite settler colonialism and the city of Pendleton's illegal encroachment onto treaty-protected land, which created the very neighborhoods that are the subject of this talk. So many communities in the American West where large numbers, why are we not moving forward? All right.
There we go.
Okay, many communities in the American West where large numbers of Chinese people once lived are rumored to have so-called Chinese tunnels under downtown buildings, streets, and sidewalks. Alleged Chinese tunnels are believed to exist in Baker City, Pendleton, and the Dalles, Oregon, Seattle and Tacoma, Washington, Los Angeles and San Francisco, California, Boise, Pocatello, and Idaho City, Idaho, Butte and Missoula, Montana, Vancouver and Victoria, British Columbia, and in many other communities in and beyond the West. Although Chinese workers did dig railroad tunnels, such as this partially completed one in Jackson County, Oregon, railroad tunnels, excuse me, are not included in this discussion and are not the type of tunnels rumored to have existed under cities and towns. The notion that there must be Chinese tunnels underneath communities throughout the American West is so pervasive that writers can assume it as fact without substantiation. Driven Out, Jean Felsler's well-regarded book on anti-Chinese activities, contains an unattributed statement reading, in many Chinatowns, homes and stores were connected by a web of hidden underground tunnels. As you would expect, the internet has a lot of information and misinformation on what have been called Chinese tunnels. Here's one entertaining example. They dug the tunnels through solid rock with spoons. I heard it from a guy who heard it from a guy who knows a person that knew someone from a family that knew about it, and had talked to a guy whose grandfather had known a guy whose father did it. Well, not quite. It was a flattened tin can, and it was his great aunt's son's friend's cousin's kid brother who told me that it was in fact his grandfather's brother's son's wife's sister's husband's brother and his two boys, Clyde and Sam, who did the actual digging. Oh, and a dog named Butch hauled the debris out on a sled. Examples like these are humorous, but other Chinese tunnel claims are taken quite seriously and often go unquestioned as historical fact. Pendleton, Oregon is one such place where Chinese tunnel claims abound, both in the public imagination and in supposedly historical accounts like local guidebooks, news articles, and even the Images of America Pendleton book, which has many fascinating historical photos, but none of the so-called tunnels. Since at least the late 1980s, local tourism, media depictions, nonfiction publications, and literary works have all promoted and embellished tunnel rumors to the extent that the subterranean structures along several downtown streets are now widely referred to as the Pendleton Underground and are believed to have been constructed and occupied by Pendleton's 19th century Chinese residents. For example, in Ken Kesey's 1994 novel, Last Go Around, a real Western, the main character is told by a Chinese man smoking an opium pipe that Pendleton's, quote, under-street property, end quote, was built by Chinese immigrants who were barred from owning or developing businesses above ground. In pursuit of a bath and a romantic interest, this character wanders into the steamy and dark tunnel network, only to wake up several hours later, lost, naked, and separated from his money belt. While portrayals like these make for high drama and clearly have popular appeal, do they have any basis in historical truth? Can Pendleton's so-called Chinese tunnels, in fact, be substantiated? If the evidence supports their existence, were they built and used by members of Pendleton's Chinese community? On the contrary, if no evidence supports their existence, are they myths with some basis in fact, such as basements that were subdivided or partitioned into smaller areas for use as businesses, living quarters, or opium smoking establishments? Or are they stereotypes, like others, such as Chinese ovens or Chinese walls, wherein anything unexplainable, i.e. mysterious, is attributed to the Chinese? This presentation investigates Pendleton's early Chinese population with the aim of determining whether their above-ground history in any way supports the underground tunnel claims that now dominate portrayals of their community. In Pendleton, Chinese tunnels have been alleged to exist in areas known to contain underground features and in other areas that lack any known subterranean features. Lore often implies a connection between these two areas, resulting in extravagant claims like, if all of Pendleton's underground tunnels were laid out in one long line, they would stretch over 150 miles in length, or that a tunnel originating downtown once extended under the Umatilla River. Coincidentally, traveling 150 miles from Moscow, Idaho, where I'm giving this presentation now, would get me to the city limits of Pendleton. That's a very long tunnel. In 1996, potential visitors were told that Pendleton's underground tunnels, dug by the Chinese between 1870 and 1930, cover over 70 miles underneath Pendleton's historic district. By 2012, neither 150 miles nor 70 miles were apparently accurate. So just what is the supposed length of them now? The most persistent Chinese tunnel myths are those associated with a single downtown block. It is bounded by Dorian Street, formerly called Alta Street, Main Street, Immigrant Street, formerly called Webb, and Southwest First Street, which was formerly known as Garden. Currently, this block includes several historical buildings with subterranean basements, old delivery access points called sidewalk voids or vaults, and other underground features. If you've ever taken one of the Pendleton Underground tours, you've likely walked through some of these features and been told that many of Pendleton's early Chinese residents lived underground in this section of the city. Pendleton's first Chinese residents, however, could not have lived here. In 1870, census takers recorded just 7 Chinese men living within Pendleton's city limits. 3 are listed as cooks, 2 as operators of laundries, and 2 lived on a farm where they were employed as a cook and a gardener for a Euro-American family. Although the 1870 census does not list their addresses, we know that they could not have lived near the so-called Pendleton Underground since it was not yet part of the city. Throughout the 1870s, Pendleton's future Chinatown, the area outlined in red on this map, was located several blocks south of the incorporated city of Pendleton on land that fell within the boundary of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. Municipal encroachment began in 1881 when construction of an Oregon Railway and Navigation Company line, which is what is indicated by the green arrow here, spurred illegal development on the surrounding reservation land. As the city of Pendleton built roads and sidewalks on treaty-protected land, Chinese railroad workers began taking up residence in the area. By 1880, Pendleton's Chinese population had risen to 20 men and 1 woman. The majority of these residents worked as laborers, some probably for the railroad, and as cooks or launderers. Sanborn fire insurance maps, published in the 1880s, show several clusters of Chinese-occupied buildings along Garden, which is now Southwest First, and West Alta, which is now Dorian. These blocks would come to be called Pendleton's Chinatown. Other Chinese-occupied buildings appear in nearby neighborhoods, including some on Main and East Webb that overlie the features now associated with the Pendleton Underground. The area now called the Underground and the original location of Pendleton's Chinatown both fall within what architectural historians have designated as the South Main Street Commercial Historic District. In order to nominate this district to the National Register of Historic Places, architectural specialists and historians first had to document the history of the proposed district and the structures within it. According to the report that resulted from these efforts, the development of this district occurred in 2 primary construction periods. During the first construction period from 1881 to 1905, Chinese immigrants built and occupied various buildings in the district. These are described as 1 to 2-story wood frame buildings, like the ones shown here, which are from Pendleton's original Chinatown on West Alta, and were likely built by Chinese residents. These particular buildings were later moved 3 blocks down Main Street to house the Euro-American blacksmith shop shown in this photo. Moving them was possible, at least in part, because wood frame buildings like these often sat directly on the ground or on simple rock foundations. Within Pendleton's Chinatown and the surrounding neighborhood, similar wood frame buildings served as residential dwellings and as commercial spaces for an expanding Chinese community that included launderers, merchants, a doctor, a druggist, and a barber. An 1893 business directory for Pendleton, published by R.L. Polk and Company, lists many of these businesses, which included at least 1 woman-owned establishment, Miss Mattie Lee's Chinese Goods at 112 West Webb Street. Business directory entries sometimes recorded both commercial and residential property, such as the building where both Mattie Lee and her clerk also lived. Other entries, like the one for 618 Garden, give only office addresses. In this case, for Tan Lee, the Chinese physician listed directly under Mattie Lee here. Since all of these addresses can also be connected with standing buildings depicted on fire insurance maps, it feels safe to assume that both the people and businesses described were above rather than underground. According to census data, by 1900, Pendleton's Chinese population had increased to at least 83 men and 1 woman. The single Chinese woman recorded in this census is not Mattie Lee, so either Miss Lee had moved in the year interim or not all residents were counted. A full 60% of Pendleton's Chinese residents lived on West Alta in the district known as Chinatown, while the other 40% lived in surrounding areas. Of those who lived in Chinatown, most are listed as laborers of some sort or as merchants. Those who lived in the surrounding district were laundry professionals or private cooks in Euro-American homes. Historical documents provide only sporadic information on events within Pendleton's Chinese community for this time, but none of those described took place underground. In June of 1900, for example, Chung Ing became Pendleton's first Chinese-American resident to vote in a local election. His vote made the papers as far away as St. Helens, Oregon. And in 1906, Lee Morehouse took this photo of a Chinese-owned retail shop in Pendleton, though he did not record the name of the store or its owners. Shortly after the turn of the 20th century, and just as Pendleton's Chinese community was nearing its most populous, Euro-American interest in the business district surrounding Chinatown increased. Between 1907 and 1937, many of the district's original wood frame buildings were replaced with brick buildings, including those now associated with the Pendleton Underground. These buildings frequently contained 2 or more stories of commercial space, and for the first time also included basements. Though some Chinese businesses persisted in their historic Chinatown locations throughout this second period of construction, much of Pendleton's Chinese community began to disperse across the city. Dispersal was accelerated by new construction, which often displaced the prior occupants of smaller and less expensive buildings. Between 1905 and 1930, the number of Pendleton's Chinese residents dropped from 70 to 24, and the proportion living on West Alta Street dropped from 54% to just 17% of Chinese residents. As a result, the vast majority of above ground and subterranean real estate built after 1907 in the South Main Street Commercial Historic District housed Euro-American businesses. Examples of this can be found in the Empire Block and Hendricks buildings, 2 of the structures most closely associated with the Pendleton Underground. Built in 1907 and 1897 respectively, these brick buildings both carry the names of the Euro-American investors or businesses for whom they were built. The Empire Block building, shown here, was built for the German-American owners of the Empire Meat Company. As constructed, it included 3 commercial storefronts on the ground floor, each with their own partition basement that could be accessed by staircase from the floor or street above. Though a partition basement is far from an underground tunnel, it is important to point out that even these basement spaces were not built or occupied by the Chinese people who had been in this location previously. That is, Miss Mattie Lee's Chinese Goods and the Hop Key Laundry, which are shown on maps from the 1890s, but not after 1907, when the Empire Block building was constructed for its new German-American owners. Built as storage spaces for the businesses above them, some individual basements were linked with sidewalk vaults to allow for direct delivery of goods. In the intervening century, however, connection to public utilities, changes in delivery methods, and commercial turnover impacted basement configuration. For example, the basement under the southwest corner of the Empire Block building, again shown here, was at one point converted into a commercial space for the Shamrock Card Room, another Euro-American business. Most recently, the basements of the Empire Block and Hendricks buildings were altered to create the spaces now used by the Pendleton Underground tours. A self-published history, More on the Pendleton Underground, describes the, quote, construction and restoration, end quote, of the supposed tunnels as follows. Volunteer crews patched walls and built new walls and hallways. A doorway was cut into one basement wall to connect to other areas. Some doorways were broken through and other doorway sections bricked in. Walls were broken through, supports secured, and concrete poured. Pipes and wiring at shoulder height had to be raised, replumbed, and rewired. It took 133 days for volunteer crews, business owners, and the Boy Scouts to clean out and prepare the tour space areas in order for the work to be completed. Alterations such as these have encouraged the perception of underground tunnels, yet clearly have nothing to do with Pendleton's 19th or even 20th century Chinese residents. Not only were the Empire Block and Hendricks buildings built by Euro-Americans, but historical maps also show that by the time they were constructed, Chinese residents were no longer the primary occupants of the surrounding neighborhood. In 1896, the block that was bounded by Dorian, again formerly Alta, Main, Immigrant, formerly Webb, and Southwest First Street, formerly Garden, contained only 4 Chinese-owned businesses. By the time the Empire Block building was completed in 1907, only 2 Chinese-owned businesses remained. Both were located along West Alta Street in the portion of the block that is not part of the current underground tour route. These two businesses, which remained at the heart of the former Chinatown, even as many of its residents were leaving the block, were a store owned by Ng Gui and a restaurant. According to newspaper articles, Ng Gui was a well-known merchant who ran a store on West Alta Street from 1901 until 1913, when a fire destroyed his business while he was traveling in China. Upon his return to Pendleton in 1914, Gui rented a new storefront, also on Alta Street, and opened a Chinese-American restaurant, which was billed as being upstairs and served noodles, chop suey, and other Chinese dishes. Gui's transition from store owner to restaurateur mirrored two larger trends within Pendleton's Chinese community in the early 20th century. By 1930, restaurant work had surpassed launderer, laborer, and all other professions to become the most commonly held job for Chinese Americans in Pendleton. In that year, the census reported that 63% of local Chinese worked in the restaurant industry. Gui's move into leased rooms in a new constructed building also appears to have been common among the Chinese American businesses that remained in the South Main Street Commercial Historic District. No Chinese residents reported owning commercial property on censuses from 1910 through 1930. While this can be partially explained by discriminatory citizenship laws that barred Chinese immigrants from property ownership, it was also likely exacerbated by gentrification, as an increasing number of larger and more expensive commercial buildings took over the real estate where Chinese-built structures once stood. Advertisements from the 19-teens provide examples of Chinese American-run businesses in Pendleton that leased commercial space within multi-story buildings. These businesses are often described as being located under or above Euro-American establishments. Businesses like Dr. Chen's Chinese Herb Company or Kondong Lo Chop Suey that operated under hotels may have been ground floor or even basement level spaces. Does this suggest that they operated within subterranean channel networks? Probably not, since they occupied rented space and needed their customers to be able to find them. It is hard to imagine that landlords of new expensive buildings would allow tenants to excavate tunnels through their foundations. It is far more likely that the Chinese businesses operated in the partitioned basements described in historical documents for the district. Some of the best evidence that Chinese tunnels never existed in Pendleton comes directly from the Chinese American community that lived there. The last Chinese American run business in the South Main Street Commercial Historic District was the Oregon Cafe, which opened in 1910 and operated until the 1950s. Years later, a researcher asked Wayne Ng, whose father had managed the Oregon Cafe since the 1920s, if there were any tunnels under the building. A member of Pendleton's Chinese American community, whose family business on Main Street had been located between the so-called Pendleton Underground and the former 19th century Chinatown, Ng denied having ever seen any evidence of tunnels. While Chinese Americans like Wayne Ng Gui, and Miss Mattie Lee all lived and worked on the same blocks now associated with the Pendleton Underground, their presence alone does not support claims of a tunnel network built and occupied by Chinese people in the late 19th century. In fact, the documentary record for Pendleton's Chinese community provides evidence of the opposite, of a small but thriving above-ground community whose members had frequent interactions with and provided many services to their non-Chinese neighbors, customers, employers, clients, and landlords. So why, given the history just described, are rumors of Chinese tunnels so persistent in Pendleton? And what, if any, evidence supports their existence? Several research avenues can help establish how Chinese tunnels have come to be associated with Pendleton and with other communities in the West. Evidence to be explored by my colleague Priscilla Wegers includes architectural features, documentary research, oral histories, and archaeological excavations.
In many cities, downtown buildings provide architectural evidence for the features often called Chinese tunnels. Some structures contain basements with walls having openings that lead to corridors under the sidewalk. In architectural terminology, these passageways are called sidewalk vaults, meaning that they are simply areas adjacent to a building that facilitate delivery of goods into the basement. These sidewalk vaults were built at the same time the building was constructed. Popular names for sidewalk vaults include hollow sidewalks, sidewalk voids, and one former resident of Walla Walla, Washington, has called them covered walkways. Glass blocks in the sidewalk allow light to penetrate into the spaces below. The glass blocks, which can be round or rectangular, usually appear purple due to a reaction between the sun's rays and the manganese contained in the composition of the glass. Access to the sidewalk vaults is through metal doors in the sidewalk above. The doors open to reveal, excuse me, either stairways, freight elevators, or ramps, often with rollers. Stores could thus receive merchandise without taking it in through the selling floor. Over time, people have come to believe that the metal doors and glass blocks relate to so-called Chinese tunnels that reportedly lie beneath them. In Lewiston, Idaho, I visited the basement of a hardware store to view doorway-type openings into corridors that are both underneath and parallel to the sidewalk above them, similar to what you saw for Baker City. Local residents have insisted that these subterranean structures are tunnels under the downtown, rumored to have been used by the Chinese to ferret gold from place to place. Of course, people are disappointed to learn that these passageways are only sidewalk vaults. Notice that they're usually blocked off where the building ends. Blocking them off would have kept people from walking underground from one building to another and would have been a security measure to prevent unauthorized access to basements. If you have ever taken a tour of Pendleton's underground, you likely also entered corridors under the sidewalk and were shown glass blocks in the walkway above them that helped to illuminate the passage between basement and street. The passageway that you were standing in, however, is more accurately described as a sidewalk vault, because it would have been built to facilitate the transfer of goods into and out of the basements of commercial businesses. It was likely constructed between 1907 and 1937, when the first buildings with basements were built on the block. These buildings, which included the previously described Empire Block and Hendricks Building, displaced the older wood frame structures built by Pendleton's Chinese residents. Excavation and construction of their basements would have been more likely to destroy than to preserve any tunnel network that allegedly preceded them. People sometimes believe that Chinese laborers brought with them from China both the technical skills for constructing tunnels and the practice of living in them. That's pretty surprising, considering that the Chinese who came to the West were mainly farmers from southern China who actually lived in houses within villages. They had no need for tunnels in that part of China and certainly did not live in them there. Furthermore, nothing in Rudolph P. Hommel's monumental reference, China at Work, suggests that Chinese peasants possessed tunnel building skills. Although some Chinese in the West certainly developed construction skills and are known to have built rock walls, did any of them actually work on construction of downtown buildings with sidewalk vaults? Most likely, those jobs were reserved for Euro-Americans in Pendleton and elsewhere. Substantive and reliable documentary evidence regarding Chinese tunnels per se is sparse. However, information that indirectly establishes the absence of Chinese tunnels as underground living spaces can be found in many documentary sources, US Census records, such as this one for Pendleton, Oregon in 1900, that identify individual Chinese people there and often provide street addresses for them, showing that they did not live underground. Sanborn fire insurance maps, like this one for Pendleton, Oregon in 1888, show where Chinese occupied dwellings and businesses were located, what materials they were constructed from, and how many stories they were. These are always above ground. As we've already seen, city directories for communities where early Chinese immigrants once lived list the names and addresses of Chinese commercial firms such as laundries, restaurants, and stores. They also sometimes mention living quarters connected to Chinese-run businesses, all of which have street-level addresses. Contemporary local newspapers contain articles about a community's Chinese population, as well as advertisements for their businesses. The vast majority of these are above ground, but even those advertised as under other establishments never mention secret passageways or tunnels. If there were Chinese tunnels in early Western communities, one would expect them to be mentioned more often in newspaper stories from the time period. One such article from a 1911 Victoria, British Columbia newspaper described a perfect maze of secret passages underneath the local Chinatown. These structures were reportedly designed for the escape of white and yellow gamblers. In investigating these supposed Chinese tunnels in Victoria, BC, geographer David Chuan-Yan Lai learned that there was an extensive storm drain system under city streets, together with huge cisterns that firemen used for storing water. Lai found multiple exits off Chinatown's alleys, as well as an ingenious double closet that allowed a person to enter one room and leave by another. He concluded that for Victoria, Chinese tunnels were a myth resulting from unsubstantiated stories that are created and passed from one generation to another. Eventually, people begin to believe them. If a Chinese person disappeared within Chinatown, pursuers, to save face, could attribute his or her disappearance to the existence of mysterious Chinese tunnels. In contrasting the tunnel myth with the escape reality, Lai observed that the Chinese did have to devise secret hideouts and escape routes as a passive means of protecting themselves against police harassment. Therefore, the escape reality is understandable, real, and true, whereas the tunnel myth is mistaken, unreal, and false. Here we see again the escape reality in the form of adjacent closets on an upper floor of a building. Similar constructions were also used in the basements of buildings, and these could appear to be tunnels to a non-Chinese observer. Excuse me. Historians have conducted oral histories or interviews with elderly Chinese residents of various towns to see if they knew anything about Chinese tunnels in their communities. For example, Chinese-American historian Laverne Mao Dicker wrote a history of the Chinese in San Francisco. She observed that local Euro-Americans who were curious to know what their faithful Chinese houseboy did on his day off would probably have been disappointed. Hours of talk with friends, attendance at a Chinese play, or an adult education class sound dull compared to the exotic pursuits such as underground tunnels filled with opium dens in which the Chinese were purported to engage. When interviewed, retired San Francisco rice merchant Jim Chang described how, as a boy, he knew all the dirty secret places in San Francisco's Chinatown. Chang recalled that when white people came to Chinatown looking for curiosities, I used to tag along behind the Chinese took as guides, but I never saw an underground tunnel, just mahjong rooms in the basement. That oral history contrasts with one from Fresno, California, in which Chinese-American Rick Liu walked the passages as a child, entering through a trap door in his grandfather's liquor store. During the 1950s, when Liu was a boy, he visited the underground world with his father, first passing through a dark basement before descending into a lighted tunnel with enough space for two people to pass by each other. There is no reason to doubt what Liu experienced, except to observe that his description of the tunnel and this photograph of it sound and look exactly like a sidewalk vault. David Tidswell's documentary research on the Chinese in Pendleton also included the collection of some oral historical accounts. One unnamed source told him that during renovation in the vicinity of the post office on Dorian, a backhoe broke into a tunnel. However, as we noted earlier, Wayne Ang, Tidwell's Chinese-American informant who arrived in Pendleton in 1937, age 8, stated that no tunnel was there, at least not in his time of 1937 to 1977. The backhoe undoubtedly broke into a sidewalk vault. Archaeological excavations are another way to establish whether Chinese tunnels exist. As part of a team that later analyzed artifacts recovered by other researchers in the 1980s from excavations at the Market Street Chinatown in San Jose, California, archaeologists Bryn Williams and Stacy Camp wrote that the site's excavators found no evidence of an extensive network of tunnels. Because the site was so completely excavated, it is almost certain that tunnels would have been found had they existed. Williams and Camp suggest that claims for tunnels underneath Chinatowns are based mainly on innuendo, rumor, and clearly biased contemporary newspaper accounts. Chinese-Canadian archaeologist Imogene Lim directed 2 excavations on Pender Street in Vancouver, British Columbia in 1996. Because of a pervasive belief that Chinese tunnels existed under buildings and streets in Vancouver's Chinatown, excavators fielded frequent inquiries from passersby asking if they had found the tunnels. Water conditions led Lim to observe that the evidence for tunnels was not convincing. Not only was Vancouver's early Chinatown marshy along East Pender, but the ground became moist just 2 meters below the surface, and the excavators reached the water table within another meter. One of the most extensive archaeological surveys of historical underground features occurred in Missoula, Montana. This multi-year excavation and documentation project found no definitive evidence of Chinese constructed or occupied subterranean spaces and concluded that in the past, European Americans had been at least equally likely to have used Missoula's underground structures as had Chinese residents. Researchers further observed that underground features like steam tunnels, sidewalk voids or vaults, and even Cold War era fallout shelters were consistently misrepresented as Chinese tunnels by modern community members. In an early visit to the Pendleton Underground tours, I observed a pile of unwashed artifacts on a table in an otherwise empty basement that was identified as a Chinese living area. Curiously, not one of the artifacts was Chinese. The guide explained that an archaeologist had conducted excavations there. Many of these so-called artifacts are now displayed along with Chinese and Japanese objects in various underground rooms and in the gift shop as evidence that Chinese people once lived and worked in the Pendleton Underground. But as any archaeologist will tell you, an artifact is only as authentic as its provenience. That is why archaeologists who must submit their credentials to the state in order to obtain permits for excavations are required to file reports with the State Historic Preservation Office after each project. Yet this 3-page summary report on Pendleton Underground excavations, which was provided to a colleague by a tour guide, has never been filed with the state of Oregon. In fact, the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office does not have any records of archaeological excavations in the area of the underground tours, nor are there any records from anywhere in Oregon of the authors of this report ever having filed for a permit, prepared an archaeological site form, or submitted a report of any kind. Beyond operating without a permit and failing to properly document their investigations, the authors of the report also seem to hold several misconceptions about both Chinese artifacts and archaeological science. Supposedly, a very damaged, oxidized coin of Asian mintage was located in the opium den, as well as the end of a very old thin pipe supposedly consistent with opium smoking. Without seeing these artifacts, I cannot comment except to say that a thin pipe, perhaps resembling the one in their advertisement, is not an opium pipe at all, but a tobacco pipe. In suggesting that a simple basement was actually an opium den, the excavators seem to be perpetuating a common anti-Chinese stereotype. If this area did house an opium smoking establishment, keeping in mind that opium for smoking could be legally imported into the United States until 1909, where are the associated opium-related artifacts that would support that interpretation? In describing the supposed opium den, the authors confidently state that the topsoil, a term that describes the uppermost layers of sediment formed by organic matter, microorganisms, and roots, and that is technically inaccurate for a subsurface basement floor, can be dated to 25 to 35 years per inch, and then apply this formula to all other areas examined. This implies that the sediment accumulated at an even rate in every room and was not disturbed or altered in any way prior to excavation. But how can that be given the history of these basements, which were routinely used for transporting and storing goods, leased and refurbished by various businesses, and then trampled on by numerous tour groups, to say nothing of the wall moving, hallway building, and doorway breaking done prior to the opening of the Pendleton Underground tours? Finally, how can the sediment and the archaeological materials found in the 1907 Empire Block and the 1897 Hendricks Building's basement predate the buildings themselves if they were never moved? The 3-page report does not address any of these questions. Another problem with interpreting the supposed archaeological evidence of the Pendleton Underground lies in the fact that if there are artifacts along the route of the tours, they are not clearly distinguished from items of uncertain provenience. The former executive director writes, after the initial cleaning and preparing of the tunnels and rooms, the task of acquiring antiques and decorating came next. Donated furnishings and collectibles were put in place. Salvaged articles from the underground cleanup work were placed on display. The first tours did not see the amount of artifacts available to visitors today. Over the past decade, there had been a constant and continual acquiring, end quote. This mixing of collectibles with artifacts, quote unquote, helps visitors imagine underground spaces as once inhabited by people and businesses, but can be confusing when given more scrutiny. For example, one of the basement areas has been fitted out as Hop Sing's Chinese laundry, with more and more items added over the years in an attempt to authenticate the experience. Besides laundry services as first presented, Hop Sing now provides baths. He has a Western-style bed and kitchen, and he no longer wears Japanese clothing as he did when I first viewed this exhibit. Although a sign on the wall says that Hop Sing operated a laundry here in 1885, the basement had not even been built at that point. If Hop Sing did work here then, it would have been in a prior building that does not show up on historic maps as a Chinese laundry, unless it was actually the Hop Key Laundry located around the corner at 110 West Webb. But then how did his bed and other artifacts, quote unquote, end up here? You may wonder, what does it matter if underground structures are called Chinese tunnels? Mainly, it matters to Chinese Americans who are tired of their culture being stereotyped by non-Chinese people and thus appropriated for their own purposes. For example, in the case of Pendleton, in arguing for subterranean passageways and basements inhabited by the town's former Chinese pioneer residents, present-day communities appear to be using these underground, buried, and hidden spaces as a modern and subtle anti-Chinese metaphor. Although it is surely subconscious rather than overt, by employing ferret-like burrowing and underground analogies to push their former Chinese pioneers below the surface, Chinese tunnel proponents are thus denying early Chinese immigrants the above ground dignity and respect that the documentary references clearly show the Chinese possessed and still deserve. Archaeologists Williams and Camp, mentioned earlier, have described how Hollywood has long used Chinatowns to both create and convey cultural anxieties about the constitution of US national identity. Films such as Mr. Wong in Chinatown, 1939, starring a non-Chinese actor, Boris Karloff, miscast as a Chinese detective, James Lee Wong, depict numerous tunnels under San Francisco Chinatown that are used to smuggle goods and people both within the Chinatown and to the docks of San Francisco. The passages suggest a direct physical link from the San Francisco Chinatown to China via the ships waiting at the end of the tunnel, thus emphasizing the foreignness of the Chinese. For decades, American films have stereotyped and exoticized the Chinese in the West. Now we are seeing it happen in real life, where financially desperate communities perpetuate myth and exotica as they strive to attract tourists and their dollars by luring them with claims of Chinese tunnels. When we examine who is perpetuating legends, myths, rumors, and stereotypes to create a biased picture of the Chinese in particular communities, it becomes apparent that it is not people of Chinese descent themselves, as seen from earlier examples of David Lai, Imogene Lim, Laverne Mao Dicker, Jim Chang, and Wayne Eng, all of Chinese ancestry, who all denied the existence of so-called Chinese tunnels in their communities. Instead, the idea of mysterious Chinese tunnels is disseminated entirely by non-Chinese people, chiefly for financial gain. Misrepresenting history, particularly anything that can be cast in a dark or lurid light for financial gain, is not unique to Chinese tunnels. In Portland, Oregon, for example, underground tunnel myths attribute these features not only to Chinese residents, but to the practice of shanghaiing or kidnapping a man, usually while incapacitated or drunk, for forced service aboard a sailing ship. Historians have found no evidence to substantiate the existence of a Shanghai tunnel in Portland, but have traced the myth to a series of newspaper articles in the 1970s. The author of these articles subsequently initiated tours of Old Town basements, staged with artifacts that he claimed were from the long suppressed history of Portland's Shanghai. Of course, some of these tour operators do not appreciate having inaccuracies in their presentations brought to the attention of the general public, as we are doing today. For example, in 1994, a group of mostly Chinese Americans from Seattle toured Chinese historical and archaeological sites in the Pacific Northwest. A Chinese American newspaper reporter accompanied the tour and wrote articles for the Seattle Times about it. The resulting newspaper story stated that the supposed tunnels were just individual basements of above-ground buildings, citing 3 of the tour's participants, an architectural historian and 2 anthropologists. After reading the article, I wrote to the author congratulating her on it and learned that the Pendleton Underground Tours had complained to her editor that her article was unfair and misleading, which coincidentally is exactly how I would describe the tour's presentation of Pendleton's Chinese history. Earlier, I had a similar experience. My files contain a telephone message from the executive director of the Pendleton Underground Tours threatening legal action against me for protesting their biased portrayal of the Chinese in Pendleton. Even though some people of Chinese ancestry reportedly have enjoyed tours of so-called Chinese tunnels, such tours do at least acknowledge the presence of Chinese in particular communities, ones where their contributions were largely ignored in the past. However, for Chinese Americans and other ethnic groups, it is extremely important that their history be presented accurately and be devoid of stereotypes. Unfortunately, some Chinese Americans who take such tours come away believing that the Chinese in that particular city built and lived in tunnels and basements under the streets of the community. This is prejudicial to the memory of the early Chinese in those towns. Certainly, Chinese tunnels tours have aided local tourism industries, mainly because people love to be entertained. However, the general public is not always the best judge of what are appropriate amusements. For example, entertainment in the past has consisted of such interesting exhibitions as Christians being torn apart by wild beasts in ancient Rome, burning witches in early New England, and guillotining dissidents in revolutionary France. One may rightly ask what these revolting spectacles can possibly have to do with Chinese tunnel tours. In essence, those who provide entertainment have an obligation to ensure that it is not offensive to or demeaning of any of the groups that are being portrayed. In the case of Chinese tunnel tours and similar tourist attractions, visitors are touring a historic site, one where real history actually happened. Because it is a real place, people expect the guide's commentary to be truthful. A factual tour can still be extremely interesting even when entertainment is not the goal. For example, visitors to Amsterdam's Anne Frank Museum come away informed, even moved, but not entertained. In contrast, made-up places such as Disneyland can have a magic kingdom or a fantasy land atmosphere, and no one expects them to be truthful. This dichotomy between the modern public's perception of entertainment versus real history is why Disney failed in its attempt to create a theme park on a Civil War battlefield. Although operators of Chinese tunnel tours surely mean well, they would be genuinely shocked to learn that they are inadvertently offending the very people that they hope will applaud them for rescuing, quote unquote, the history of the Chinese in their communities. However, instead of presenting fake history, they could contribute to real history by demolishing the Chinese tunnel myth, refuting the legends of Chinese supposedly living underground, and adding a museum-type exhibit honoring the local Chinese in their community. The tour could thus be enjoyable even while it presents history that is both accurate and sensitive. Others who have accomplished this successfully for many thousands of visitors include the Wing Luke Asian Museum in Seattle, Washington, the Portland Chinatown Museum, the Kam Wah Chung Museum in John Day, Oregon, and the Buckeye Temple exhibit at the Lewis Clark Center for Arts and History in Lewiston, Idaho. All portray the history of the Chinese pioneers in their communities in a truthful and meaningful way. Today, intelligent people deplore overt racism based on race or national origin. Often, however, they are guilty of unconscious or inadvertent prejudice, meaning that their supposed good intentions conceal latent anti-Asian bigotry and stereotyping. According to a report published in 2001 by an influential committee of 100 Chinese and Chinese American leaders, the majority Euro-American population still perceives Asian Americans as foreign, no matter how many generations they have lived in the United States. This perception of foreignness is why, born in the USA, Asian Americans often get such insulting, quote unquote, compliments as "you speak English so well," when English is the only language they know, and questions such as, "Where are you from?" When the answer is Oregon or Seattle, meaning that's where the responder was born, the questioner comes back with, "No, where are you really from?" meaning what foreign country. Since the start of the global COVID-19 pandemic, the perception of perpetual foreignness has also contributed to a dramatic increase in anti-Asian violence and hate speech. Briefly, more cultural sensitivity will prevent local communities from perpetuating legends, myths, rumors, and stereotypes about the Chinese who once lived there. We have a little time that I can actually mention in contrast, the Dalles, Oregon. And for the Dalles, Oregon, unlike Pendleton, there seems to be no danger of the Chinese tunnel myth being perpetuated there in order to lure tourists and separate them from their money. Instead, in the Dalles, there is a genuine desire to understand the structures that have in the past been called Chinese tunnels and to separate the real from the fake. Although the Dalles does have a long-standing tradition of Chinese tunnels, local historian Marilyn Ernest has pointed out that there needs to be a definition of what Chinese tunnels actually are. My personal definition would include the fact that anything called a Chinese tunnel has to have been built by Chinese people. It is not something that non-Chinese people built, even if Chinese people later used it for their own purposes. With that definition in mind, we can look at various reports of Chinese tunnels in the Dalles to see which ones might be authentic and which ones are not. As you will see in a moment, the first example is definitely authentic. In mid-September 1890, the first national bank in the Dalles was robbed by means of a tunnel. Initial reports called the robbery the work of experienced burglars, and the Chinese perpetrators were not then suspected. This event was in the news as far away as Missouri. By the end of September, the robbers were known to be Chinese and were described as smooth celestials. Here, the story is from a Los Angeles newspaper. It names 3 Chinese men, Ah Gum, Chin Sing, and Louis Lun. Ah Gum was arrested, confessed to his part in the robbery, and named the other Chinese who were involved. Over 30 years later, the details of the 1890 robbery were clarified in an article in the Oregonian. Ah Gum, now called Chewy Gum and also known as Ah Sin, had owned a laundry in the Dalles. The actual robber, Ah Jung, promised Chewy Gum and the laundry's workers a share of the gold. The tunnel took Ah Jung a year to dig. Archaeologist Eric Gleason, a resident of the Dalles, who is also presented on the Chinese at the Dalles in this forum, together with Jackie Chung, speculates that this would have been the location of Ah Jung's tunnel. It ran from a Chinese building, possibly Chewy Gum's laundry, or the vacant building next door, under the alley and beneath the foundations of the First National Bank. The other bank, marked with the green arrow below Washington Street, was the French and Company Bank on the southeast corner of 2nd and Washington. According to Eric, documents in Chinese Exclusion Act case files indicate that the French and Company Bank appeared to have been the preferred bank of the Chinese community. The 1921 Oregonian article further indicates that Ah Jung obtained about $9,500 in $20 gold pieces from the bank's safe. According to an inflation calculator on the internet, $9,500 in 1890 would be worth more than $250,000 today. After paying $2,600, over $70,000 today, to Chewy Gum to buy his silence and that of the other laundry employees, Ah Jung fled to San Francisco and boarded a ship bound for Macau, a Portuguese colony near Hong Kong. Ah Jung reportedly lost his money in an illegal enterprise there. 2 weeks after Ah Jung's robbery and successful escape, Chewy Gum was arrested. He had delayed fleeing, hoping to sell his laundry first. He planned to travel to San Francisco by train, but his nervousness attracted the attention of the station agent, who called the sheriff. A search of Chewy Gum's belongings revealed his share of the gold, leading to his arrest and confession. In November 1890, Chewy Gum was sentenced to the state penitentiary. He served his time and went back to China, but returned to the Dalles in 1910. No one looked up his criminal record, so he was allowed to re-enter. Besides the real Chinese tunnel just mentioned, there are many underground features hidden beneath towns and cities. A partial list of the main ones include basements and sub-basements, sidewalk vaults, cisterns, sewers, and storm drains. Over the years, various residents of the Dalles have reported entering below-ground structures. Some of these appear from the descriptions to be linear features reminiscent of sidewalk vaults that also access basements and sub-basements, and others are of unknown construction and purpose. For example, in the mid-1960s, the Ernest family was digging for bottles. It's not that one. Sorry. Okay. For example, in the mid-1960s, the Ernest family was digging for bottles in the area that later became Ernest Motors. Marilyn described it as follows, quote, "The present street level was approximately 12 feet above, but this section of the property had not been filled in. We were digging under the old rotting wooden sidewalk. Under that sidewalk, our 10-year-old son, Mark, found a tunnel opening and explored it with a flashlight. He went some distance and came into a room, an area wider than the tunnel, and then went no further. With the flashlight, he could see that the tunnel ran alongside the railroad tracks. Apparently," end quote, "apparently it went parallel to the railroad tracks going west to east towards the Baldwin Saloon." Here's a different building, also adjacent to railroad tracks. That would be the Waldron Drug. According to Eric Gleason, the railroad tracks were raised several times between the 1860s and the 1880s. This was part of a larger effort to make First Street level with Second Street and to alleviate downtown flooding. Fill now covers the original entrance to the building. This raises questions of Was there a sidewalk vault here originally? If yes, was it destroyed or filled in before the grade was raised, or does it still exist underground? Were the old railroad tracks removed or just covered over? This excavation in the Dalles shows a doorway that used to be at street level. Could there be a sidewalk vault beneath the excavated area? A local resident told Marilyn Ernest of his experience in a different part of town, quote, of going down into tunnels underneath the railroad tracks from the south side of First Street heading toward the Columbia River. He and a friend took markers so they could tell which way they went and where to return, end quote. His location matches the same location that many in the Dalles have mentioned. It's the area between Union and Washington Streets from the alley going north toward the Columbia River. Here's another view of a door or window. Oh, sorry, I think we're out of sync here with the slides. This is the right one. Here's another view of a door or window that was originally at ground level before the fill was added. Was there originally a basement in this building? Did this upper level become the new basement? If yes, did the old basement become a sub-basement? Were there sidewalk vaults here? And if yes, what happened to them? Were they filled in or do they still remain underground? For example, another local resident who used to work in the credit union on the corner of First and Washington reported that the building's owner, who had multiple properties in the area, would disappear into the sub-basement only to pop up unannounced at one of his other properties. In 1922, nearly 100 years ago, Frank Heater, then chief of police for the Dalles, vehemently discounted rumors of a supposed tunnel in Chinatown. Reportedly, according to a Portland newspaper, the tunnel was over 100 feet long and ran from the Pekin Cafe to Chinese stores on First Street. Chief Heater commented there was no such thing in existence. Apparently, fake news is nothing new. Therefore, Chinese tunnel claims from many Western communities can be debunked as myths. Similarly, the rumored Chinese tunnels in Pendleton do not survive the close scrutiny provided by archaeological evidence, documentary research, oral history, and archaeological excavations. And now Renee Campbell will summarize this for you.
So in summary, although many members of Pendleton's above-ground Chinese community lived in the same neighborhoods now known for underground tours, the basements, sidewalk vaults, and other below-ground structures on this block were not built or owned by Chinese people, nor were they occupied as anything other than street-level or basement-level businesses, and these were not disproportionately frequented by Chinese residents. Pendleton's so-called Chinese tunnels are a myth. Perpetuating that myth feeds persistent racist stereotypes that deny Pendleton's Chinese community its above-ground history in favor of a, quote, entertaining tale that reinforces tropes of Chinese victimization and dangerous foreigners. It is demeaning to the memory of the Chinese who immigrated to the West during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Your interest in this presentation is a tribute to the intriguing and real history of the Chinese in Oregon and the West. Thank you very much for watching.
Turn us back on. Yeah.
And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and restart our video.
Renee and Priscilla, thank you so much for this really enlightening presentation.
Oh, you are so welcome.
As you can imagine, we have a lot of questions for you in the Q&A and very interested parties in the chat as well. So thank you to everybody who's participating in this Q&A. First question is from Bernadette Janet and Sharon Roberts, actually, together. They both took away a similar vein to your conversation. Bernadette asks, I noted that the SF-born voter was still described in the news article as not American, nor as well-spoken as an American. Was it common to consider American-born Chinese born at that time to be foreign citizens? And to tack onto that, Sharon Roberts asked, do you think that the tunnel myth is tied to the fact that many of these cities were sundown towns?
I'm not sure about that. Do you have any comment on that?
On the sundown part of it?
Oh yeah, let's start with that.
I think that a lot of it could be. I think that also a lot of the features that are found when they are actually tunnels for other things are for like Prohibition era or then Cold War era features that are put underground. So I think it's tied to sort of a larger history of other purposes of going underground, but I'm not sure about, you know, sundown laws having any effect on that. I haven't seen any direct correlation, at least in what I've done.
No. And as far as the, you know, Chinese people being, you know, seen as perpetual foreigners, I mean, that is so true today even. The Committee of 100 that did their first survey in 2001 has updated it fairly recently and found, you know, similar things today. And again, as I mentioned, really seeing Asian Americans as foreigners helps to perpetuate the violence against them.
Thank you both for that. Ray Lu asks as well, any suggestions on how to debunk or clarify this fantasy misinformation during a tour in order to help dispel the racism? Today, that would add to the unconscious and subconscious perception of the perpetual foreigner, as you mentioned, Priscilla.
Mm-hmm.
And he notes that these types of tours should be considered entertainment.
I just wish that the Pendleton Underground tours would try to present the real history of the Chinese in Pendleton, as they do in the, you know, Wing Loop Museum, the Bakai Temple in Lewiston, and so on. I think that would add immeasurably to their presentation. They do show other things that are interesting. I mean, they have a card room in the basement, which apparently was there. Upstairs, there are bordellos, which apparently were there. It's just, I just resent them bringing the Chinese into the picture because the Chinese weren't there. I mean, they do have an interesting attraction, but if they just leave the Chinese out, I don't think I'd have any complaint.
Yeah, and I would say in terms of if you are on the tour, maybe asking some questions while you're along the tour route, like how do you know that Chinese people lived here? How did this laundry operate underground? How did he dry his clothes?
How did he dry the clothes?
You know, some of those questions might help, but it's also largely, I think the people who are operating the tours are sort of unaware of the ways that they are perpetuating these really damaging stereotypes, and so they may resist.
they think they're doing a good thing, and they think that they're, you know, they've recovered the history of the Chinese in Pendleton, and all they have to go on was the unspoken belief that the unwritten law that the Chinese could not be above ground after sunset. And there is, you know, all the historical evidence that Renee has uncovered shows that this, you know, they had above ground homes and businesses like anybody else, of course.
Sure. To tack onto that, Sue N. Ho from Portland asks if there's evidence that indicates that Chinese merchants were living at the same locations of their businesses, of course, above ground.
Yeah, so there is some evidence of that, particularly on old maps. The Sanborn fire insurance maps are maps that are incredibly detailed because they were made for insurance purposes. So they tell you like what the buildings are made of and how many stories they are, you know, what type of roofs they have, often they'll tell you, you know, like where the fireplace was or something like that. And so those will list dwellings, and then sometimes they'll list dwelling / business. And so you know that it's both. Another way that you see Chinese people residentially living sometimes with their businesses is in the business directories, which will list, you know, in the case of Miss Maddie Lee's store, it lists that she and her clerk also both lived in that same building. So So I don't want to say that all Chinese Americans in Pendleton were also living in the place of their businesses. Some had some buildings are labeled simply as dwellings, and those are also in that same Chinatown area, but they are just used as primarily as dwellings.
An earlier question from Bernadette regarding Mr. Guy's business in Pendleton. Was the business that burnt down while he was away the result of arson, or was it a fire?
So that is, it's not specified in the newspaper articles that I could find, but none of them mentioned it being arson. I think that fires were also pretty common during that time period for chimney fires and things to start. So I don't really know. The newspapers don't specify one way or the other.
And I don't think we know if anyone was actually, maybe he'd, let somebody else work the business for him while he was gone. And so it wasn't empty and abandoned. So someone could have been in there, and there could have been a chimney fire that set the rest of it on fire. It's like, we just don't know.
Yeah. Jackie Peterson is commenting that in the late 19th century, here in Portland, the Chinese workers or laborers were provided dormitories in back of like 2 or 3 story buildings that were, built and occupied by the Chinese merchants. And the issue of housing laborers brought to the West by Chinese labor contractors and other merchants was a serious one, even as late as into the 1940s. While there were no tunnels per se, there were basements under most buildings in Portland's new Chinatown, and connections were made between them, were part of a system with upstairs and downstairs steel doors, escape passages from, of course, the police raids of lottery and other gambling establishments. But there is definitely no evidence of Chinese living beneath streets. But however, the late Bruce Wong did mention that some of the workers may have slept in the sidewalk wells or vaults in the winter because they were warmer than perhaps the above ground quarters. And it is a very good, important topic, and she wants to express that you guys are doing great work.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Denise Lee wants to comment that this was so well done and point made on above ground history. She herself is a 4th generation Chinese American and understands receiving the comment, no, really, where did you come from, or your parents? And she herself is working in the Mendocino area, and she's working on the Temple of Kwantai in Mendocino, California. Reading more comments from Kristen. Might the racist myths about these Chinese tunnels be linked to the vague knowledge about the role of the Underground Railroad for enslaved Black people? The latter's existence would have been within the memory of living people, and could the tunnel myth be like so many other aspects of colonial Oregon, which imported Civil War era beliefs and assumptions about race?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly if underground tunnels were on people's mind, maybe that helps to sort of start those rumors in various communities. But yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting avenue for further research.
Jackie Peterson Loomis has a question as well about what have you found about the workers' living quarters in Pendleton's Chinatown?
Well, you found some stuff in the some things in the historical record. I mean, these would be earlier.
Yeah, so it seems like the first, there were a few handful of Chinese people living in Pendleton in the 1870s, but really the population grew when the railroad came through town. And so many laborers for the railroad ended up in Pendleton and then stayed. And so their first homes were sort of informally built along the railroad route, as we discussed, which was then actually the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And as laborers moved into the rest of the city of Pendleton, a lot of Sanborn fire insurance maps do show buildings that are described as dwellings that have multiple people living in them. So I think that they're and they're often row house, like many houses in a row. So there's one section along West Alta where there's 3 or 4 structures in a row that are Chinese dwellings for 20 years that exist on the maps up until the second period of construction, when more of the brick buildings start coming into the neighborhood. I hope that answered the question.
From Wenna Tai, she's asking, do you have any thoughts on mounting a concerted or collective campaign against these racist myth makers? Individual questioning while on tour may not be very effective and could incur hostilities from other people on the tour. After all,
oh, very
they're to
true,
be
very true.
entertained,
Yeah,
not to
yeah.
be educated.
Oh,
well, you've tried in the past, right?
Maybe this will help. Well, I have an article we have an article in, I don't have an example to show. Go ahead.
In the Oregon Online Encyclopedia?
Oh, the Oregon Online Encyclopedia, there is one. And then also in, in Chelsea's book, which I don't have here.
Okay. Yeah, so I think, Priscilla's published a chapter in a book on Chinese tunnel myths in the West. We, it's a conversation actually that Priscilla and I have had about like how do we best disseminate this information? Because as archaeologists, I get really upset when I see archaeology used to perpetuate things like this. And so my initial instinct is to sort of publish things in the archaeological literature, but that doesn't necessarily reach the general public. And so we thought maybe the Oregon Online Encyclopedia would be a better place to reach more of a broad audience. But ultimately, I think, it has to come from more voices probably. So I don't really know what that looks like, but I think it would be great if anybody has any ideas.
You mentioned about Priscilla's books. There was an earlier question for Priscilla about where your books may be available to purchase.
Oh, now this would be, which book would that be? Which book are we talking about? Because I just now mentioned an article that I had in Chelsea Rose's and Ryan Kennedy's book on
Chinese diaspora archaeology.
Thank you. The title is Chinese diaspora archaeology. So I have a chapter in that. But the other books, they're pretty much available on Amazon. They're still in print.
There are also a number of publications for sale on the AACC website. You can buy them directly from us, and then we get the little extra bit of money, and you can buy them online now, which is a new thing since we redid our website.
Good point. And if you do buy them from us, you can get them autographed for free.
Very nice. Can you add that link onto our chat, Renee?
Yes, I can do that.
That would be wonderful, and we'll make sure to. Folks have asked about the non-Amazon capabilities, so thank you for sharing that as well.
Oh, right, okay, and bookstores too. You can ask at your bookstore. They can look it up and get it from the publisher.
Okay.
A question from Karen on: do you think that underground tunnels were actually created and used by white folks for vice purposes, and then were claimed by them as being built by the Chinese in order to take the focus off of their illegal activities?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in many cases, just the fact that there are tunnels, right, is a myth, that these are sidewalk vaults, they're delivery entranceways. Yeah.
It's an architectural term as what they're called. It's sidewalk vault or void. And it did have a definite purpose of getting the goods into the building without going through the shoppers on the selling floor. I don't think that there's a connection. I think it's because people see something that they think is mysterious, and we don't understand what this is, but there were Chinese people in the area, so they must have done it. And so that's where we get Chinese tunnel. Besides Chinese tunnels, we get Chinese walls, Chinese ovens, and so on. And these are structures that people see. They don't know who built it. Let's blame the Chinese.
From Janet, we have a question. Do you have any information about Chinese fire drills as related to Chinese settlements in the West?
Well, there were Chinese fire companies that were organized to fight fires. And that may be what that reference is referring to.
And from John Ratliff, since today's presentation is about the early Chinese residents in Pendleton, Would it be possible to approach the people in Pendleton who run these tours, talk with them and correct their misinformation on the tunnels?
Well, in a way, I think that's more up to not us, because we don't even live there, but it may be more up to the Umatilla County Historical Society to create, to correct misinformation in their own city. I mean, you hate to come in as somebody from the outside telling other people what to do, because they're not interested. But I think that the Pendleton Public Library, I know that they do have some information, and what we could do is share this with them and at least call it to their attention, and maybe they would be sort of spurred to do something. But in the interactions that I've had with the Pendleton the Pendleton Underground Tourists over the years, they're very vocal at standing up for what they think is legitimate, and they think they have a legitimate attraction, and that they truly believe that the Chinese were living down there under the ground, and they have no proof of it. And I think we have demonstrated that it's completely false.
And one last comment here before we close it up here from Julia, and I know she's saying from all of us, this was so fascinating and so incredibly well researched, and it was way much more entertaining than the lame myth of the tunnels. You two should go on the road with a debunked series. I totally agree.
We should set up a little booth directly across the street. Get more tours.
The real story.
Thank you. That's a really nice comment.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you both again. I'm going to bring Anna Truxas back, and she will close out our conversation today.
Yes, I totally agree with that last comment as well. Priscilla and Renee, wonderful presentation. My favorite kind of history, the debunking of these harmful myths and falsehoods, and really just showing how truly interesting the factual information is and how important it is. So thank you again for that. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us today as we close out what has been a wonderfully detailed look into important Chinese American historical sites here in Oregon. If you'd like to rewatch this program or share it with others, a recording will be made available on our website at www.portlandchinatown.org by Monday, December 20th. And a quick note about closed captioning. We are making it a priority and hope to have all of the videos captioned. So please check back with that, with us about that as well. And just thank you again to all of our presenters for the wonderful material that you've provided throughout the year. We hope you'll come back for future online programming with Portland Chinatown Museum in 2022. Until then, happy holidays. Thanks again.
Thank you.